My son told me, "We only let you live with us for your pension." At my 60th birthday dinner, the candles on the cake were still burning when Brian heard his son say it. He had been reaching for the cake knife, 60 candles, one for each year of a life he'd thought was worth something, when Daniel leaned toward his wife and said it low, the way people say things they don't expect to be heard. "We only let him live with us for the pension anyway." A murmur, a small, ugly fact, dropped into the warm air of the dining room like a stone into still water. Brian's hand stopped above the handle. No one else heard it. His daughter-in-law Renata was already cutting the cake, the blade pressing through the white frosting with a soft hiss. His grandchildren, Lily and Caden, were arguing over who would get the corner piece. The room smelled of pot roast and birthday candles, and the particular kind of warmth that Brian had spent 18 months telling himself was real. He picked up the knife anyway. He cut the first slice himself. He smiled when Lily said, "Happy birthday, Grandpa Brian." He said thank you, sweetheart, in a voice that sounded to his own ears like someone else's voice. And then he put the knife down, folded his napkin beside his plate, and went to bed at 7:30 on his 60th birthday. While his family called after him that the cake was still warm, he lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the popcorn ceiling of the room they'd given him. Daniel's old study, really, the desk pushed into the corner to make space for a twin bed and a particle board dresser. He thought about his wife, Margaret, dead 4 years now, and how she had always said that Daniel had a careful heart. "He thinks before he gives it," she'd said once. "Some people are like that. It doesn't mean there's less of it." Brian had believed her then. He'd believed a lot of things about his son that had been comfortably dismantled since. He thought about the pension. 41 years with the county road department, and yes, it was a good pension. Not rich man money, but steady, reliable. The kind of money that could cushion a household, pay down a second car, cover the addition they'd put on the back of the house 2 years before Brian moved in. He'd wondered at the timing of that addition. He'd wondered and then pushed the wondering away, because wondering felt like ingratitude. And he had not wanted to be the kind of man who moved into his son's house and spent his days cataloging the mathematics of his own welcome. He got up at 5 in the morning. The house was dark and silent. He moved through it carefully, the way he'd learned to move through spaces that weren't his, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad he'd bought for himself, because there was no paper in the house he felt entitled to use. He sat there for a long time. The sky outside lightened from black to deep blue to the thin gray of early March. He wrote 2 things on the legal pad. The first was a number, his monthly pension deposit, which went directly into the joint household account he'd opened with Daniel when he moved in. He'd offered that himself, insisted on it actually, because he hadn't wanted to be a burden. Margaret would have said that was his trouble. He was always so goddamn careful not to be a burden that he forgot he had weight, that he was allowed to have weight. That weight wasn't the same as burden. The second thing he wrote was a date, the date he'd moved in. 18 months ago. He thought about what the house had been like before he arrived, Daniel working long hours, Renata managing the kids mostly alone. The small tensions of a household with not quite enough money and not quite enough time. He thought about the nights he'd stayed late with Lily's reading and Caden's nightmares, and the 3 months last spring when Renata's mother was sick and Brian had cooked every dinner, driven every carpool, become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the household that he'd forgotten to ask himself whether the fabric actually wanted him. He tore off the page and folded it into his shirt pocket. At 7 o'clock he called his friend Ray, who had a 2-bedroom apartment above the hardware store in Millbrook. 40 minutes north. Ray's wife had died the year before Margaret. They'd been meaning to play more golf. They'd been meaning to do a lot of things. I need a favor, Brian said. Name it. Ray said, because that was the kind of man Ray was. Daniel came downstairs at 7:45. He was surprised to find Brian up, and more surprised by the 2 packed bags beside the front door, and his face moved through several expressions in quick succession before settling on the one Brian recognized from Daniel's childhood. The look he'd worn when he knew he'd done something wrong but hadn't yet decided whether to own it. Dad, what's... I heard you last night, Brian said. He kept his voice even. He'd practiced it during the 40 minutes between Ray's call and Daniel coming downstairs. About the pension. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere upstairs, a child's feet hit the floor. Daniel opened his mouth and closed it. His jaw tightened. For a moment, Brian thought he might deny it, the way he'd denied. At 9 years old, having broken the neighbor's window, right up until the moment he realized denial was going to cost him more than the truth. But Daniel was 50 now. Not 9, and some things do change, Dad, he said. I didn't. He stopped. He looked at the bags. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did you mean it? Silence. How did you mean it, Daniel? His son sat down heavily in the chair across from him. He rubbed his hands over his face. He looked, Brian thought, very tired, the kind of tired that had been accumulating for a long time, maybe longer than last night. We were arguing, he said finally, Renata and me, about money. I said something I shouldn't have said. To your wife or to the room? To her. He looked up. I didn't think you could hear. That's worse, Brian said quietly. Not better. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I know. Brian picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now. Falling across the table where his grandchildren would sit for breakfast in a few minutes, where he had sat every morning for a year and a half, making himself useful, making himself small, making himself into whatever shape fit most comfortably into someone else's life. He was 60 years old. He had 41 years with the county. He had 2 bags by the front door and a friend with a spare room 40 minutes north. He was not, it turned out, without options. I'm going to stay with Ray for a while, he said. He's got the space. I'll figure out something more permanent in the spring. Died. I'm not angry, Brian said, and found that it was mostly true. What he felt was something quieter than anger and more durable. A kind of clarity. I moved in here because I was lonely and I thought it would be good for everyone. Maybe it was for a while. But I don't want to be a line item, Daniel. I spent 60 years not being a line item, and I'm not going to start now. Footsteps on the stairs. Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair tangled, 8 years old and squinting at the morning. She looked at the bags. She looked at Brian. Grandpa, are you leaving? He looked at his son. Daniel was staring at the table, at his own hands, at something Brian couldn't see. His shoulders were the shoulders of a man who had just heard himself clearly, perhaps for the first time in a while. That was something. That was not nothing, for a bit, Brian said to Lily. He held out his arm and she came to him, and he held her the way he'd held her father once, a long time ago in a house that was fully his own. But I'll be back for Easter, and I'm going to teach you to make your grandmother's pie. The one with the lattice top. The one with the lattice top. She pressed her face against his shoulder. Brian looked up at his son over the top of her head. Daniel was watching them. His eyes were wet. Brian was not a cruel man. He was not going to catalogue his son's failings or extract a reckoning or ask for an apology, though he thought one might come, in time, in the halting and imperfect way that apologies came from men who had careful hearts and didn't always know what to do with them. He stood. He set Lily gently on her feet. He picked up his bags. "I'll call when I get there," he said. He drove north through the thin March light, the bare trees on either side of the highway, the long flat field still grey with the last of winter. The yellow legal pad was on the passenger seat. He didn't need it anymore. He rolled down the window an inch and let the cold air in, and found, to his mild surprise, that it felt something like relief. The particular relief of a man who has finally stopped making himself convenient. Ray was waiting on the steps when he pulled in. He had coffee ready. There was a key on the kitchen counter, and he pointed to it without making a thing of it. Brian picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, small and ordinary, the kind of key that opened nothing special and everything necessary. He put it in his pocket. He sat down. They drank their coffee, the two of them, in the good, uncomplicated quiet of two old men who had nowhere they needed to be, and Brian thought that 60, in the end, might not be so bad a place to start.